My apologies. I believe that I had double muted myself. So I'm just going to start at the top here and really just welcome all of you and wish you good afternoon. My name is Regine Webster. I'm the Vice President of the Center for Disaster Philanthropy. We are so pleased to be hosting this webinar in partnership with our friends and colleagues, the Funders Network for Smart Growth and Livable Communities. They're also our colleague in the Philanthropic, Preparedness, Resiliency, and Emergency Partnership, which we all know by the acronym PREP. This work, funded by the Margaret A. Cargill Philanthropies, gathers community foundation leaders from a 10-state region in the Midwest to work to really build their internal capacity to weather disasters and also to strengthen their leadership in guiding their cities and states toward better outcomes following disasters. Our webinar today is going to focus on the roles of public media and public libraries in community planning and long-term recovery from disasters. Well, we've really watched over the past years as local newspapers have ceased publication, they've moved to fewer issues, or they've been purchased by larger conglomerates. And we've also seen commercial radio and TV follow a similar pattern in diminishing support for local investigative and public service reporting. In our disaster work, we really just know how important local media and libraries can be to recovery, though, by providing accurate information as well as safe spaces for convening and research. The New Orleans Times-Picayune won a Pulitzer Prize for public service for its reporting during Hurricane Katrina. And then most recently, the Texas Tribune has served as just this incredible primary source of reporting on recovery from Hurricane Harvey. Ham radios, Spanish language station, and small religious broadcasters serve specific populations with urgent evacuation and safety notices and reminders of disaster assistance registration deadlines. Our guest today will help us learn more about how national and local public radio and public libraries are enhancing community outreach in times of stress and crisis. Joining us today are Mary Fran Tyler, the Senior Director of Strategic Planning at NPR, Jay Pearce, the CEO and General Manager of public radio station WVIK in the Quad Cities, 90.3 FM, Colleen Sivwarp, the Director of Finance and Membership Services at WVIK Quad Cities 90.3, Kelly Thompson, the Vice President for Grantmaking and Community Initiatives in the Quad Cities Community Foundation, and Dr. Michal Linder, PhD and Adjunct Faculty at Virginia Tech University. Kelly Thompson, I should have mentioned this, sorry Kelly, she's a member of our PREP initiative. And she's actually on our webinar today to talk about how her community foundation has become engaged in this work. Before we get started, a few bits of housekeeping. This webinar is being recorded, and you may submit a question at any time using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. And we will really do our best to make sure that everybody's questions get answered at the end of this webinar. So again, just use that Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. And now I'll go ahead and turn over the mic to Maureen Lawless, the Vice President and Director of Member Services from the Funders Network. Maureen?
Thanks so much, Regine. On behalf of the Funders Network for Smart Growth and Livable Communities, I'm so pleased to welcome you to this webinar and to partner with our frequent collaborators from the Center for Disaster Philanthropy to present it. As Regine noted, this session emerged from the Philanthropic Preparedness, Resiliency, and Emergency Partnership, affectionately known as PREP, and we're pleased to share it today with both the PREP cohort and other interested colleagues. My thanks to Kelly Thompson from the Quad Cities Community Foundation for both suggesting the topic and helping to design and shape this session, to all of our presenters for their time and expertise, and to Kim Mathis-Early, Regine Webster, and their CDP colleagues for producing the event. The mission of the Funders Network is to inspire, strengthen, and expand funding and philanthropic leadership that yield environmentally sustainable, socially equitable, and economically prosperous regions and communities. We host a range of funder working groups and learning opportunities throughout the year, including an annual conference to be held on March 18th to 20th in Miami. Registration for that event will open later this week, and the program will include a session focused on the philanthropic role in disasters as we navigate both increased frequency and severity of these devastating events. Thank you for your time and participation today, and I hope you'll learn from and find value in today's webinar. I'll now turn the floor back over to Regine.
Thanks, Maureen. I'm going to kick the microphone right on over to Mary Fran Tyler, again, Senior Director of Strategic Planning at NPR.
Thank you, Regine and Maureen and Kim. I appreciate your time and the time of your audience and inviting us to talk a little bit about what we're trying to do to help communities in times of disaster. Next slide. Just to give you a little bit of an overview, I'm at NPR, and NPR manages the Public Radio Interconnection System, which means that we connect more than 1,200 public radio stations across the country with content and information. We are able to reach about 95% of the U.S. population. That's in all the 50 states as well as territories. Next slide. You might ask why public radio is involved in emergency alerting. There are several reasons. One is, in times of disaster, oftentimes the power will go out. So the reliance people may have on television or mobile phones may not be there, but radio is always available, either using battery-operated, solar-powered, or previously charged radios. NPR and our network of stations has about 2,200 journalists across the country who are ready and available in times of emergency. We have about 450 here in our headquarters in Washington, D.C., and in our bureaus across the country. We also have a very highly reliable and secure distribution network which operates from Washington, D.C., but we also have a backup network operations center located in St. Paul, Minnesota. And we also have the capability of moving studios to different parts of the country, such as New York or Culver City, California. So that means that we're really available both technologically, but also from an information standpoint before, during, and in the aftermath of an emergency, whether it is a man-made disaster or a natural disaster. Next slide. So we began to explore this more than 2 years ago with a program called the Great California Shakeout. This is a test drill that the state of California runs every year in October to simulate what would happen in the event of an earthquake. We reached out to 6 of our stations in California to ask them to work with us to participate in the drill and to be able to not just broadcast information during the drill, but also send text alerts that would be synchronized with the over-the-air broadcast. And our aim was to ensure that they would be viewable on a variety of platforms, ranging from car radios to mobile phones, computer tablets, station websites that might be operating with streaming, and desktop radios. And we were gratified that the Corporation for Public Broadcasting was willing to work with us on this pilot and support us. Next slide. So I want to show you a little bit about what it looked like. Here's an example from KQED, and this is what the car radio display looked like. So the information on the edges is information that normally appears on this particular car radio that is developed by the original equipment manufacturer. But KQED was able to add the shakeout message that you see in the middle of the screen there. Next slide. Here's another example. This is from Central Coast Public Radio in California. This is a smaller station that serves the Central Valley. And here are 3 different examples of what it looked like when they participated in the shakeout. On the far left side is a mobile phone where you could click on that link to visit the Shakeout test site offered by the state of California. And you can see the scroll at the bottom of the screen also shows that it was a shakeout test. The two images in the middle are from a radio, and the reason it looks a little shaky there is not because of an earthquake, but it was really because the information was scrolling across the bottom of the screen, notifying people that this was a test drill. And then on the bottom right is an older form radio, older HD radio that was also scrolling the information. This is really to show you that the station can reach folks on a variety of different platforms where they are, whatever equipment they have that could show this information. Next slide. So we've had considerable success with that shakeout, and we wanted to expand that opportunity. So we are currently in the middle of a project called Tornado Alley. Again, this is also funded by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. In this effort, we're working with 27 public radio stations in the Midwest, areas that tend to be those where tornadoes occur. And I've circled WVIK here because you'll be hearing a little later from them on their experiences. The next few slides I'm just going to rapidly go through to give you an example. Much like the California Shakeout, these are some examples of how it has turned out in some of those stations. From Norman, Oklahoma, which turns out to be the epicenter of tornadoes in the world, KGOU was in the process of installing this equipment at their station, we call it middleware, and getting it up and running, but in fact, they had a live tornado. So what was supposed to be their test became an actual live tornado alert. And this is taken from an image from the car of the general manager who happened to be driving at the time of the alert. Next slide, please. At Iowa Public Radio, the same thing happened to them. They were about to do their test, and they ended up with a live tornado on the ground. On the left side, you can see the information was starting to scroll. This is from an older car radio, and on the right side, from a different car radio. Next slide. Again, in Kansas, Wichita, Kansas, here's an example of an alert. Now, this is on an older desktop radio. And the next slide, please. In Nebraska, which serves the state, this is from their state network. On the left side, you can see the alert that occurred on a mobile phone. Again, this was a live warning. And they also have automated their alerts so that they can be carried by their Twitter feed. Next slide, please. In New Orleans, WWNO has creatively decided that when there is not necessarily a live alert, they are carrying the weather forecast because weather is so important in New Orleans. So they have weather scrolling during times when other programming information is not scrolling or alerts. Next slide, please. And to give you an overview, so here's where we are so far. Between these two projects, we have equipped about 10% of public radio stations in the country. It's really our hope that we will be able to get to the other 1,100 stations. It's a bit of a process. Every station is designed and configured differently. Every station is owned and operated and managed independently. But our team is working with all these stations to try to ensure that we have the available funding to be able to purchase the equipment, to train those folks in the stations to be able to automate some of the alerts and then manually be able to issue alerts. Next slide, please. One of the most important things here, though, is to remember that with all these stations across the country, because they are independently owned, operated, and managed, they are really, we see them as the pillars of their community. And they are the most important reflection of what's going on in their communities. We rely on them to understand the needs of the community, and as part of this project, they are working closely with their community and elected leaders. Many have already reached out to first responders to let them know that we have this kind of capability. We're also trying to reach out to state government emergency management organizations as well as to the local FEMA organizations. And just to remind you that this kind of technology can be used not just for earthquakes, not just for tornadoes, but for a wide variety of potential emergencies that communities face. We want them to be able to be equipped to determine how to provide information, the best kind of information to provide before, during, and after these emergencies. And it can include everything from the actual emergency itself to things such as recommendations of evacuation routes, where shelters might be available, where residents could find fresh water supplies or groceries. Next slide. And finally, we were gratified just last month to receive another grant from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting to purchase three emergency transmitters and two emergency studio kits for stations. Our idea behind this is that in times of emergencies, if there is a station that suffers a loss, either they cannot reach their studios because of potentially floods or other emergency, that we could ship them a studio kit, and if their transmitters are damaged, we could ship them a transmitter that they could use in the interim while they are having equipment fixed. So I thank you for your time, and I'll be happy to answer questions a little later in the program.
Thanks so much, Mary Fran. I think that is so interesting. As a Tennessee-based avid NPR listener, getting an inside view on what you do is really, really interesting. We're now going to hear from Jay Pearce and Colleen Sibworth, sorry, Colleen, both with the WVIK Quad Cities 90.3 FM. But first, I'd love to invite Kelly Thompson, Vice President for Grantmaking and Community Initiatives at Quad City Community Foundation, to tell us a little bit about her experience in this realm.
Absolutely. Thanks, everyone. And as a fellow NPR junkie / groupie, this is a really exciting thing to be a part of. So again, I'm Kelly Thompson with the Quad Cities Community Foundation, and I thought I would just offer as introduction to Jay and Colleen's remarks, the thought that it's not always easy to know where you as a funder can start to show up in the disaster resilience space that may not have been a priority for you or something that you've thought of. So I will just share one on-ramp that worked for us and led us to a stronger connection with WVIK, leading into that opportunity for WVIK to share what they're doing to help our community be stronger in the face of disaster. Next slide. So the Quad Cities, you saw it on Mary Fran's map. It is a bi-state metro area on both sides of the Mississippi River, also known as where Iowa and Illinois spoon. Next slide. So for us, our disaster experience, of course, includes floods. That is something that the Community Foundation had been involved in the response to, particularly in 2008. But we really got a chance to deepen and to expand our engagement in the disaster space through our participation in PREP, the Philanthropic Preparedness, Resiliency, and Emergency Partnership through the Funders Network and with CDP. And so we got the chance to assess and build our capacity to serve our community in the case of disaster. Next slide. So through that involvement, we did our assessment of our community and ourselves. So how prepared are we to survive and meet the increased need in our community, and what would be our role? So since you're in this session, and as I look at the list of participants, I see some of my fellow PrEP people, but also a lot of people whose names I don't recognize. So maybe you are, or maybe you aren't working in the disaster space, but at least this must have been a question that you asked yourself, or that you're ready to ask yourself. And because there are so many different answers and options for funders to show up in this space, we found it helpful to look at it in the context of our current roles and priorities in serving our community. So we established through our workbook process, our assessment, that our region's nonprofit sector could really benefit from training and technical assistance to be prepared when, and not if, disaster strikes. And most of the organizations we spoke to were willing, but they didn't really feel able to provide the same or additional levels of services to the community in the case of disaster. So one of our existing ongoing priorities is supporting a strong nonprofit sector through capacity building, so it made sense to incorporate that approach when addressing disasters. Our objective was to get a variety of organizations to participate in a program to learn more about how disaster would affect them, to create or refine their disaster and continuity of operations plans, and if necessary, come for us to funding to ensure that those additions or changes to their plan were done in a timely manner. And alongside these organizations, we took part in this training to improve our own outdated organizational plan, to learn alongside our peers, creating and deepening the partnerships and relationships that we have. Next slide. A really key partner in this, and something that I really tell everyone when I talk about this, is our local extension office. The University of Illinois Extension in our area has several educators who are part of the Extension Disaster Educators Network, which goes across the country. And we're really fortunately able to take some existing resources that are existing for businesses, make them really specific to the needs and challenges and opportunities that exist in the nonprofit space, and create a program to deliver this. Next slide. So the program basically was a cohort model with 3 different rounds of up to 10 organizations taking part. A half-day training, which I think of as sort of a scared straight thing, where they all learned what disasters could befall all of us, and what basic preparations could be taken to be ready for them. But we all know that it's easy to go to a training, be enthusiastic, and then do nothing with that knowledge when you have to go back to your day-to-day life, and that it's easy to put disaster preparedness on the back burner. So we combined that training with on-site technical assistance from our disaster educators and grant funds to encourage them to complete those plans and get something in return for doing so. Next slide. So we set out to target providers of critical community services. We sent also an open invitation to all nonprofits, but we started really thinking, who are critical providers of basic services like shelter, food, and other things provided, particularly to vulnerable populations. So in total, our ultimate nonprofits participating included a food bank, child care services, elderly care services, homeless shelters, other residential programs, a mental health organization, and ultimately nonprofit media members. But next slide, please notice we did not target WVIK, and that's kind of embarrassing with what we know now. We absolutely would, if we were doing this again, pay attention to public media, and I think we will probably hear later, our public libraries. We're really fortunate that we had a relationship with them already, and that they saw an opportunity for themselves in our open invitation. And as a community, we're really fortunate that they used this experience as a springboard to take on an increasingly important role in our region's disaster preparedness. So just, as a learning point, since you are already on this webinar thinking about supporting public media to show up in the disaster space, you are already ahead of where we were at that point. Next slide. This is a quick slide from a presentation we gave about a year ago with WVIK and our extension partners to the Extension Disaster Educators Network. You'll get to hear in a minute about the fact that WVIK, a year on is much, much more than a work in progress at this time. Next slide. But first, I will just share a couple of lessons that we learned through this work. Number one, of course, as I said, you're already ahead of me. Think of public media as a critical component of your community's approach to disaster resilience. As you're figuring out where to show up in this space, let your current community roles and priorities guide you in deciding how that works. And that also goes for your grantees. They may not see themselves in this space, even if you end up talking to your local public media or public libraries, they may not see themselves, but if you can help them see how it supports their current mission, that may be very helpful. Find great partners, see what your local extension office can offer for you if they have a local or regional disaster educator. Definitely give it time. As we say next here, carrots help. Those grants and that support did help in encouraging organizations to take the time for this. But even so, life gets in the way, state budget crises get in the way, other community priorities get in the way, and this work needs to be patient. But the simplest steps can make the biggest difference. We had several organizations note that disasters, large or small, that they faced after simply getting a plan in place, making sure they had the right numbers to call when disaster struck, gave them a lot of comfort and made those situations go better than they could. And also, finally, involve your local volunteer organizations active in disasters or community organizations active in disasters, your VOAD or COAD. And that is something that we're working to do more with the organizations that we supported in this. And I think that that is also something that WVIK is getting more engaged with our local disaster providers. So with that, we can go to the next slide. That concludes my setup of how one funder had an approach to getting engaged in the disaster space, and I will turn it over to Jay and Colleen.
And thank you very much, Kelly, and hello to everyone who is listening. So to kind of go off what Kelly said, first of all, before we get into our formal presentation, and Colleen and I will share this, but we're not shy at WVIK of inserting ourselves into other people's missions to show how a public radio station can align in the nonprofit community with many organizations. And when the Quad Cities Community Foundation began talking about this coordination of nonprofits in response to a disaster, it just seemed like a natural for us. So if you go to the next slide, here, you can see what we do as a local public radio station. We're more than NPR, although we hitch along with the NPR brand because it's a good one. And I'm on the NPR board of directors, by the way, and that kind of also led to developing the relationship out into NPR with Fran. And so relationship building is what we're about. We do it through programming here at WVIK. All of the logos that you see there for programs are locally produced programs, exclusive to the WVIK audience. And so we're very involved in the community. Most of these programs are produced in partnership with other nonprofits or other organizations in the community. Some of the podcasts, like Riverway Stories, is a collaboration with River Action, which is concerned about our watershed. As you will notice in our coverage map, where we straddle the Mississippi River, so the environment is a big deal to us. There's a nuclear power plant upriver from us. That's something we're paying a lot of attention to. In fact, FEMA is in the building this morning. Colleen can tell you about that in just a couple of minutes. But other things that we do with the community tie us into economic development, arts, culture, and of course, emergency response seem to be a natural off of that. So if we look at the next slide, we can see that our mission is basically to serve the community. That's why we're here. That's why public radio stations exist. We're not here to make a profit. We're here to reinvest, seek resources to do things, to invest in our product to our listeners. And that's a whole gamut of things from arts, culture, to news. We are the only radio news department in a market of 350,000 people. And that seems a little astounding. There are about 20 radio stations here, and we're the only ones with a news department. You'll find that in a lot of communities now. The public radio station will be the one with the news department. And NPR takes that very seriously, and we're working on a new compact relationship with stations to make sure that those local stations have the resources they need to serve communities well nationwide. As Mary Fran said, more than 90% of the country is covered by NPR these days through its local stations. And so we have a responsibility for the community to react to disasters, not only alert as they're happening, but react afterwards. And that's where a lot of this is coming in. But go to the next slide and we'll see our coverage area up and down the river. We have a repeater station in Dubuque. We have our main signal in the Quad Cities that gets up about 60 miles out. And we're in the process now. We've negotiated a deal to put on a second radio station that'll be concentrated on news and information in the Quad Cities area. So we're pretty excited about that. So if we go to the next slide, we can see some of the ways that we have begun taking seriously this notion that that we should be more involved, especially with the nonprofits, since the Community Foundation raised that point. And I'll let Colleen take it from there.
So a few years ago, we were invited to this training program offered by the Community Foundation of the Great River Bends, which has recently just been renamed the Quad Cities Community Foundation. So forgive me if I stumble across that. I'm still relearning. And that hosted this training program through the University of Illinois Extension Service. And they came out and they, as Kelly said, they did terrify us for one afternoon. And then we came back to the office and decided to develop a group of staff members to help identify where we thought we could use some improvement in our disaster plan and preparation. And we identified the needs that we needed to improve upon, a budget, and then started working on seeking funding. Our needs specifically that we identified was the need for a new generator. You saw a picture of our old one with the side laying on the grass in Kelly's slides. We wanted to secure our facility, not so much just that we were so concerned about break-ins or that sort of thing, but we do have a lot of very expensive equipment here, and it has given a lot of us some comfort to know that people aren't just wandering in around the building when when we're short on staff, which we do not have a lot of staff in our building. We identified that we needed a backup location. I should step back. We have installed the new generator. That's the picture you see there on the left. And we have added a lot of security features to our building, which has been a big improvement. And we're in the process of completing the backup location to be able to broadcast should our main antenna or tower or facility be compromised in some way, so that we can continue to broadcast to the community. That has been held up while we are waiting to get the contractor out to actually install the antenna, but all the rest of it has been put in place. The fundraising is done. We just are operating on someone else's schedule right now. We still need to work on communicate with and train our staff. That's an ongoing process, and as well as how we want to communicate to the public. Next slide, please. So as I just said, we installed the new generator. Now we have the capacity to power our whole building. Before we could just power portions of the building, and we were greatly hampered by the fact that hardly any lights in our building were powered with the old generator. So that was a big improvement. The security alarms and cameras have really improved the outside of the building, as well as our comfort on the inside. We gathered important information that we needed in case of emergency, like our insurance policy info, our list of donors, our program suppliers, staff contact list. All of these were things that were we reviewed with the educator from the University of Illinois Extension Service, who all of it seemed pretty basic stuff to gather together, and it wasn't difficult to do. So we store all that stuff in a location that's off-site so that we could gather it if we needed to. And we began to really work to develop a staff awareness of our emergency plan, where we would go in case of emergency. And now we have sort of a regular schedule of kind of reviewing it with the staff, as well as making sure that new staff are trained on these kind of activities, so that they feel informed in case of emergency. And then finally, we installed the Arctic Palm software, which is the middleware that Mary Fran was talking about before, that delivers the metadata through our over-the-air signal, making it available anywhere that a radio has some sort of display. Next slide, please.
So this is what the metadata looks like at a test on our station. And taking this further, we're launching a new app to put our stations out in public. We're on Next Radio, we're on different platforms. And the idea is that people might not always be listening to the radio, so we'll get the information to them with whatever platforms we're operating on. The other thing is that for a long time, I've always been somewhat irked by the fact that we put out the first alert, and maybe it's the National Weather Service or the EAS goes off, and that first alert goes off, but people's listening habits aren't such that you're always glued to the radio. So what if you missed that? What if you tuned in 1 minute after that alert, and we don't give an update for the next 15 minutes to a half hour or so? Then you've missed it, and you may tune out within that 15 minutes. So we don't, there's no way to have like on television, a constant crawl going on radio. Well, now we can. We can put it right on your radio dial. It can go to your smartphone or other methods of giving updated information on a consistent basis. And then afterwards too, we're not going to be on the air constantly giving information, but we can do that with these other delivery platforms, which would be great. And then the next slide will show you that we have kind of a workflow worked out as to who's going to feed into things, what kind of things we can cover, what else we can do with the metadata. It's just becoming a whole new information delivery system to us that we're pretty excited about. And as far as why FEMA's in the building, if you go to the last slide, Colleen can explain that in our last minute.
So we're working on currently with our local emergency management agencies through the COAD or the VOED that Kelly mentioned earlier. And currently today, the Rock Island County Emergency Management is actually doing their tests that they are required to do by FEMA to show that they are prepared in case of a nuclear disaster here in our community. They have, they partnered with us. We're the station that they encourage all of the people that live around the nuclear reactor to tune to. And FEMA's out here, that's what these folks were. They're actually just testing to see how well Rock Island County is prepared for this kind of event. We've been through several trainings this fall, working with them to see all that goes into setting up sort of a command center for this. Been really eye-opening for us to experience that kind of training. So just to wrap up, we're also broadening our severe weather coverage. We are working to develop internal communications so that we can say who's going to do what here within our building and take responsibility of making sure that the data gets disseminated on all of our different platforms. And we're going to continue to offer preparedness information to new staff members and annual trainings to keep everyone informed on what to do in case of emergency.
Thanks so much for that, you all. Jay and Colleen, it's so interesting to hear about your very current, very relevant experience in the Quad Cities. And certainly Kelly, whom we've gotten a chance to get to know and work with over the past 4 or 5 years. It's always great to hear your insights and how this work very much plays out in your own community. I want to remind everybody that if you have a question, in lieu of raising your hand on our Zoom platform, if you could please go to the Q&A chat box and enter your questions in there, that would be ideal. I'll call attention to Val Hosky, who's reached out to all of us, and he said to reach out to, excuse me, I'm reading slowly here, reach out to your county amateur radio clubs, involve them at your backup emergency location and community response plans. Consider utilizing public library space as an information center to communicate with public too. So some good advice from our listeners here. I'd like to now turn over the stage, please, to Dr. Michal Linder, who is adjunct faculty at Virginia Polytech Institute, as well as the Institute and State University. Michal, over to you.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. It's such a pleasure to talk about libraries in this context. I just want you to sort of read this as my first slide, and then we'll move on. This is such a little story that I found of a woman who, seeked libraries, the comfort of a library following Hurricane Katrina. But you can move to the next slide, so I'm not behind. And so there's, recently we see a lot of stories about libraries and about their roles, and we see more and more that libraries are doing. Next slide, please. The most extensive research was conducted following the 2004-2005 hurricane season along the Gulf Coast of the U.S. Many scholars explored different services provided by public libraries in Alabama, Florida, Louisiana, Mississippi, and Texas, and found that access to the internet had an important impact on community members. The internet was useful in locating missing and displaced family members, completing FEMA insurance form, checking for news and updates, and attempting to find information about the states of individual homes. The Gulf Coast public libraries, however, were able to assist their community far beyond access to computer information. Examples are creating community contact centers, staffing shelters in library buildings, distributing food and supplies, providing hookups to recharge electronics, providing library materials to evacuees in shelters, providing FEMA, Red Cross organization with place to meet. You can stay in this slide, not move on yet. In another study, the National Library of Medicine conducted a project to identify the role of libraries in disaster management in the South Central region of the US, also Arkansas, Louisiana, Oklahoma, New Mexico, and Texas. The authors recognized differences or different roles public libraries play following natural disasters, such as you can read, institutional supporters, collection managers, information disseminations, planners, community supporters, government partners, educators and trainers, etc. Next slide, please. Another study found roles and function of libraries as safe places, providers of normal service before and after storms, disaster recovery centers, information hubs, providers of evacuees, cultural organization, liaisons between emergency management agencies and cultural institutions, improvisers. Scholars also have highlighted the role technology play in fostering community resilience by sharing information about preparedness through the web portal for libraries. That happened particularly in Florida. The web portal provided an effective means of organizing and assisting the community in preparing and recovering from hurricanes. Next slide, next two images, next two slides. Another one, please. Another slide, please. Thank you. So I like this picture because clearly it tells us that the services following hurricanes range from providing electricity and assistance with paperwork to using library buildings as shelters and housing emergency responders and volunteer organizations and organizing donations and first aid and sending bookmobiles to remote areas. And this sort of picture emphasizes it. Next slide, please. So there was this initiative by FEMA to empower various parts of the community. They call it the whole community approach. various parts of the community while encouraging great awareness among them to work together in delivering disaster. And then following that, FEMA and researchers encourage federal and state agencies to work closely with local organizations to create this disaster response plan. So this idea of disaster response plan that was really, really important. After Hurricane Sandy, there was this the collaboration of NGO, faith-based organization, businesses into this federal and local disaster response plans. Now, in terms of library, the discussion of libraries as an essential resource in disaster recovery remained in the library literature. And in practice, libraries continue to be excluded from community disaster preparedness, even though we know now that they've been doing so much. This suggests that library cannot play a proactive role. Even library employees underestimate the importance of library in disaster to some extent. And even emergency managers do not have libraries on their radar as a resource. Next slide, please. So planning is important. But planning is it's not easy when we're talking about organization, that emergency is not part of their mission. Each disaster is different and involve unpredictable set of actors. And how do we really know who is going to show up in this network and as part of the plan? And then we have various actors, and they vary in their perception and assumptions about the nature of the emergency, their role and capacity to assist, and what is the appropriate form the reaction might assume. Next slide, please. And so I found this fascinating, and I thought maybe we should ask the question and collect data and find out what library officials think. What do they think about their role in disasters, and what factors influence their decision to do more than just or to do more than what they have to do, in other words. Next slide, please. And so the literature on disasters and combined literature and sociology, they're all talking about this idea of stability and flexibility dynamics. So responses to disaster range from spontaneous activities and improvisation to execution of plans. In other words, organizations do not always automatically follow established routines. Sometimes they can deviate from the plan. So I found that really, really interesting. And I thought it's really important to find out what is it that they're thinking. Next slide. And so I sort of divided it into three potential, and this is getting a little bit, I divided it to three potential responses. One, those who would be ignoring and say, hey, we're libraries, we're not doing beyond that. Just let us do what we normally do. And then those who would reduce complexity, I would be more reactive, would say, we will do something, but within our role. And then those who would be more proactive would say, we are willing to transform to something totally different, to become a shelter, to organize donations, to do far beyond, to transform to something different to accommodate the needs of the community. Next slide. And the factors are that I found in the literature, they range from, so what influenced their decisions could be financial and human resources, lack of plan, cultural features, but also individual perceptions and choices as managers, which I thought was really interesting. Next slide. I gave them this little story about, a potential hurricane. What do you think? What are you going to do? Are you going to keep the library? You can read through this. I'm not going to read it exactly, but would you want to just leave the library as it is? Would you open the door? Will you actually invite people, call them and tell them, hey, we're open, come and join us? Next slide. And this is another set of questions. What happened when people do show up? What do you do with them? Do you offer them what you normally offer with extended hours maybe, or more story time for the kids, or would you transfer to become something different? And so they had to rank how they think they should act. Next slide. And so just an example for what people say, those who, I'm trying to be really, really brief here, those who say we ignore, said, hey, we're just a library. I don't necessarily see a library as a place that would shelter people. A building isn't built for us for that. We don't have showers, we don't have kitchens. We're very different from a place that would be used as a shelter. This is just an example for one type of response. Next slide. And then those who would say, because we are flexible, we can mold the library to feed the needs, whatever that need might be. If we need to be a shelter, if we need to be extended hours, if we need to be a place for people to have community meetings, we are willing to adapt to the needs of the community. So those are sort of the little answers that they provided, or along the line the answers that they provided. Those who decided to be more entrepreneurs in nature. Next slide, please. So I found that there were competing expectations and values that shaped managers' beliefs associated with the perceptions. So there were variations in how they responded. And it's mostly how they perceive their role as public servants, I found, influenced their decision, whether they were more conservative in the decision or more defensive of the role of the library, you know, what is the real role of the library, or maybe some of them were more entrepreneurs and more sort of risk-taking, and we want to change, and library is changing, and you know, and the environment is changing, and we're going to adapt based on the needs of the environment. Next slide. And so recognizing these organizations are innovating management practices in advance is important to establish those plans that we were talking about, to take really advantage of local actors and resources and capabilities of what they can offer. But what I found is we really have to understand that it's all at the end up to the manager to understand the sort of managerial behavior. Do such entities have enough resources or autonomy to assume a new role? Do they identify with this new role? Do they view their organization as potentially performing this new role? So it's really at the end, I found, and based on my research, it was up to the manager and how they perceive their role, the image of their organization, how they perceive the libraries, as well as how remote they were. I looked at more urban part of a network type of libraries, as well as more rural libraries that were more disconnected from the emergency network. I think this is what I have right now. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much, Michal. That was really interesting, and it's so wonderful to hear all of your hypotheses really come out grounded through your research. We've definitely got a couple of Q&As that have come in, so I'd love to go ahead and turn these Q&As over to our speakers. The first question is, it's a two-part question, so I'm reading off the screen here. Do all public radios use the same messaging templates so the information is uniform from area to area, and are those templates uniform across all emergency providers, fire, police, National Weather Service, etc.? And the second part to that is, are messages translated into different languages? Mary Fran, do you think that you should take that question first?
Sure, I could address that. Every public radio station is unique. Its architecture, software and hardware architecture is unique. Having said that, we have developed templates that can be used by each station. However, we work with the stations on how they determine how to set this up and how to craft the messages. The national messages, such as presidential level alerts, would be issued from here in Washington, D.C. However, for local or state alerts, those would be controlled by the local station. Many of the stations that are so equipped now also rely on feeds they get from the National Weather Service. I hope that helps.
Super helpful. Thank you so much. Our next question, also two-parter, it says, this sounds like the community resiliency groups that have been funded by grants, but again, many exclude their libraries from this. It would be nice if libraries could have a seat at the various EOCs, Emergency Operations Centers. Michal, is that something that you could speak to, the sentiments in those?
I think would like the same. Most of them would like to be part of the team, to be in the decision-making process. And I think they're thriving for that, and it's in the process. They're more and more included. There's more awareness. There's more scholarship on this. There's more attention. They're getting more and more attention because they're doing so much. And so definitely this is a fair point.
I have a question for you, Kelly, which is about funding. How do you change the perception of library funders?
So that's a really good question when it comes to any sort of organization seeking funding for something that some funders may perceive as outside of its mission, and in this case, disaster funding. And what I heard actually from Regine's boss at CDP, Bob Ottenhoff, is really the question is when you're talking to your funders, okay, well, my focus is really library services, those core things you provide to the community. Well, imagine what we will be able to do or what we won't be able to do if we are not prepared to survive and meet increased need in the case of disasters. So helping them, having number one on your own thought through what that means for you, what roles you would be interested in playing, and then painting that picture for those funders to see, we are a critical resource for our community. It's very important that we be prepared to follow these roles that we already do, and probably these larger roles in case of disaster, and you'll be better able to make that case if you are connected in the ways that Michal has suggested and that other commenters have suggested with other organizations who are working on community resilience in these areas.
Makes a ton of sense, Kelly. Well, we are heading quickly into the top of the hour, so I'm going to go ahead and wrap us up. The goal of our conversation today has been fourfold. First, we really wanted to understand public media's role as an independent source of information and local reporting. We also wanted to understand the initiatives that our speakers talked about that really capitalize on building local public media capacity during disasters. We've investigated how public libraries perceive their roles in disaster response, and we've also identified and articulated some of the challenges that exist to maintaining and enhancing public institutions in their disaster response efforts. I am so thankful to all of our speakers, Fran, Tyler, J. Pearce, Colleen Sibworth, Michal, Linder, Kelly Thompson. So thankful to my colleagues over at the Funders Network for Smart Growth and Livable Communities. This webinar, as we mentioned, it is being recorded. We will send an email after we conclude our webinar, and it'll have a link to the recording that will, as the question came across to us, it will include all of the slides as well. It goes to a YouTube channel. Ever so thankful for all of your assistance today and the good wisdom that you brought forth, and looking forward to speaking with you all again soon. Many thanks. Goodbye.